If we were to rank the aspects of Sublime Text that are a little confusing for new users, then right near the top of the list would be the configuration system of Sublime Text, and in very close proximity would be the key binding system of Sublime Text. Like the configuration file system, it uses text files instead of a GUI interface and is very powerful and expressive, but can take a little bit of getting used to. So in today's video, let's demystify key bindings in Sublime Text. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to this video on key binding basics in Sublime Text. Before we get to that, though, as a reminder, if you're finding these videos in any way useful, helpful, or informative, please let me know by using those buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And as always, if you have any questions or comments or suggestions for other Sublime Text topics, please leave those down in the comment section below this video. You can also, of course, hit me on Twitter at ODAT Nerd. The topic today is, of course, key bindings in Sublime Text, demystifying them a little bit and coming to grips with that. And before we get started, I'd like to point out that there is official documentation for this, which I have linked down in the description of this video. And throughout the video, we'll be looking at key bindings, and I am using the package dev package, which we have covered in a previous video on the channel. And package dev provides, amongst other things, enhancements for key bindings in Sublime Text. So you're going to see enhanced syntax highlighting and error detection, and also things like auto completion and snippets that makes working with and creating key bindings much easier. So if you're not already using that package, your experience will be slightly different than what you see here, but the same fundamental concepts still apply. Or you could go ahead and install package dev because it's a pretty darn neat package. So let's go ahead and dive on into key bindings in Sublime. Now, if we wanted to look at the default key bindings that ship with Sublime, what we would do is go into the Preferences menu and choose the Key Bindings item here. And the Preferences menu is on macOS under the Sublime Text top-level menu item. And much like the Settings command, using this command opens a new window that is split vertically. I'm going to maximize that. And on the left are the default key bindings for whatever platform you're currently on, which for my case right now is Windows. And on the right are my user-customized key bindings. And we could look in this default key bindings in the left for a variety of reasons. We might want to just investigate and see what commands are available that we could bind something to. Or we could look over there for research purposes. If there's a key binding that does something sort of like what we want to do, we could look through there to see what that key binding is so we can use it. Of course, if another package has clobbered over one of those, for example, the revert modification, which we can see is at the top of my user defaults. That's something that ships as a default key binding in Sublime, but the origami package overrides it. So if you wanted to make sure that the default binding still applies, you could copy it over and apply it into your user settings. You could, of course, also copy default bindings and change the keys or change the arguments to the commands, or even change the commands as well if you wanted to customize those bindings. Now, it turns out there are actually more key bindings than just this. These are the default bindings that ship with Sublime, but packages are free to define their own key bindings if they want to. Not all packages do that, but some do. And you could get at those by, again, going to the Preferences menu, and this time you would go to the Package Settings menu, where most packages will add an entry here for themselves. And we can see, for example, the Override Audit package that I'm the author of has an item in here named Key Bindings, and choosing that, again, opens a split window, which we can maximize. And we can see here on the left are the default Windows key bindings provided by the Override Audit package. And on the right is the exact same user key bindings file for myself. So if you needed to investigate key bindings provided by specific packages, for the purposes of finding them to see if they conflict, or to copy them, or to see what commands you could be binding to keys, that is the way that you can do that. And I should also point out that, and we covered this also in the settings item as well, this item here in the top level menu is just Preferences key bindings. In older versions of Sublime, this was two items. There was key bindings default and key bindings user. And the default command would open the file that usually appears in the left-hand side of the new settings window. And the user command would open the one file that opens in the right-hand pane. But recent versions of Sublime open those both for you at the same time in a split layout. Some packages do that, as we just saw Override Audit does. platforms, but not all packages do. For example, the origami package has options for key bindings default and key bindings user. And if I was to choose key bindings default, we can see that what has opened here is the default key bindings for the origami package, again, for the platform that I'm currently on. So that is doing the exact same thing as that other menu item would. So again, if you're looking at instructions online or you're confused because people are talking about default settings versus user settings, those two menu items have been coalesced into one. But if there's a package that doesn't have that, you choose the default option to be able to see those files. Some packages don't advertise their key bindings in a menu, and primarily that is packages that ship directly with Sublime, which are language support packages. They have their own language-specific key bindings that ship inside of their package, so they're not part of the standard default key bindings. And when in doubt, you can always use the view package file command from the command palette, which we have seen in many videos. And this again shows you every resource in every package that's currently loaded and not ignored in Sublime. And if you were to filter that on Sublime key map files, you could see every key map file that exists, which includes the default ones and your user key bindings as well. And we can see here a variety of packages that have key bindings that don't appear in the menu. For example, the C++ package, which is the one that ships with Sublime. And choosing that provides key bindings that apply when you are editing C files. Now, it is worth noting that this file, as we can see, is named default.sublimekeymap and not default Windows, such as the other files are. That's a very specific case. If a key map file doesn't have a platform in brackets, i.e. Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, then that means that that's a binding that just applies to all platforms. It's not super common for packages to use key bindings of this nature because keyboard requirements on different platforms sometimes require different conventions. For example, on Mac OS, a lot of commands use the command key, whereas on Windows, there is no command key and control would be used instead, and things of that nature. But this is something to keep in mind. As we've seen, there can be an arbitrarily large number of key bindings files that exist in your copy of Sublime Text. There's a fair number of them just in default Sublime, and the more packages you install, the more potential key bindings there can be. And it stands to reason that Sublime must be loading all of those key bindings into memory so that it can execute commands when you press keys. And it also stands to reason that it does that in a very specific and reproducible way, because if it just loaded all of those files all willy-nilly, then every time you started Sublime, key bindings could potentially be different if multiple packages provide the same key bindings. So in fact, Sublime does follow a very specific set of rules. We're going to call those the 3 rules of loading Sublime Text key bindings. The first rule is that the key bindings from the default package are always loaded first. That ensures that the default key bindings are put in place for whatever platform you're currently running Sublime Text on. The second rule is that your user package, your user-defined key bindings, which are the ones on the right-hand side of key bindings windows, are always the very last key bindings to be loaded. That's to ensure that your key bindings trump any other key bindings that might exist. And the third rule is that the key bindings from all other packages are loaded based on the name of the package that they're in. And more or less, what Sublime is doing is taking the list of all of the packages, sorting them alphabetically, and then loading the key bindings out of them in the alphabetical order by the name of the package. Now, as we can see, if we look at the key bindings file themselves, what it actually is a list of key bindings objects that associate keys with commands, but it is a list of items. And what's actually happening behind the scenes is that Sublime is taking the lists of key bindings and just appending each one. So the very first file that's loaded is the default key bindings, which is the left of this window. So that provides the initial list of default key bindings. Next, Next, it would load alphabetically the contents of every other package except for the user package and append those key bindings to the bottom of the ever-growing list of potential key mappings. And the last thing it does is load our user settings, which again are the right-hand side of this window. And the items in this list are the last added. And when it comes time to actually execute a key binding, when you press a key, what Sublime is doing logically is starting from the bottom of the list and scanning upward, trying to find a key binding entry that looks like it matches the key that you have pressed. And if it has, and if context of the key is correct, which is something we're going to talk about in just a minute, then it knows it has found a key and it executes it and it's done. If that entry doesn't match, then it proceeds upwards through the list until it eventually finds the command that it needs or runs out of items. And that's why your user bindings are always loaded last. They'll be the first ones found before all of the other bindings. But if you don't have a binding for a command in your custom bindings file, then eventually Sublime makes its way to the top of the list and finds the default binding and executes it there. Now, this points out a very important thing that can catch some people by surprise, and that is you might decide that, for example, you want to bind new window not to Shift Control N, which is the default, but to a key binding of your choice. So what you would do is take that, copy it, and paste it into your user bindings, and now pressing that key will create a new window. But pressing Control Shift N will also create a new window. And this can be confusing because a lot of software binds commands in such a way that they can only be bound to one key. But the system that Sublime is using isn't constrained by that. As we know, it's a list of key bindings. So when you press Control-Shift-N, Sublime starts at the bottom of the list, scrolls upwards through the list, eventually it finds the default binding and creates a new window. If you want to completely disable a default binding, what you have to do is copy it into your user key map and then map it to a command that doesn't exist. And a standard command for that is no-op, or N-O-O-P, short for no operation. That's a command that doesn't exist. So if that command was bound to a key, when Sublime hits that key binding entry, it tries to execute that command. It can't find it. It doesn't generate any errors. Sublime doesn't generate errors if you bind a key to a command that doesn't exist. That effectively blocks that particular key from doing anything. It's also important to point out that in Sublime key bindings, you can apply a context to a key that allows you to say in what specific circumstance that key is active. And using that, you can have multiple key bindings that use the same physical keystrokes, but which are different and differentiated based on the circumstances that they're used in. And in that case, it can be important what order the key bindings in your file are. But that's a little bit more of an advanced topic, so we'll talk about that soon. Now, I should also point out that logically speaking, we know that what Sublime is doing is having a big list of key bindings and looking at it from the bottom upwards. Internally, that is very likely not what it's doing. It's likely very optimized indeed. And we don't actually know exactly what is happening inside the internals of the core, but it's enough for us to know how it logically behaves because that helps us get a handle on how the bindings work. Now, as we said previously, a key binding file is a list of key bindings objects, and that means that the very first character needs to be an open square bracket, and the very last character in the file needs to be a close square bracket, because those are the JSON characters that represent a list. And one of the more common problems people have with key bindings is copying a key binding that someone gives them directly into the file, overwriting the square brackets, or putting it after the square brackets or before the square brackets. That is invalid JSON. It needs to be a list of one or more items. You can look at the file that's open in the left of the window for a template on best practices for how to lay out your own custom key bindings. And every key binding object is a JSON object, and objects in JSON are wrapped in these brace characters. And because I'm using package dev, we can immediately see a problem here with the syntax highlighting, and that's because of the second most common problem that people have with key bindings, and that is that every key binding needs to be separated from every other key binding by way of a comma at the end, so that it is a distinct item. Now, these are JSON files, but Sublime's JSON parser is relaxed, as we pointed out in the video on configuration, which means that it supports comments, which JSON normally doesn't, and normal JSON is very sensitive to trailing commas in the last item of a list. The JSON loader in Sublime has no such compunctions, so as a matter of best practices, you can always add a comma to the end of any key binding you add, even if it's the last one in the list, and it will still load in Sublime. And that makes sure that whether you decide to add a key binding above or below any other existing key binding, it will always work and it won't catch you out. But if you were to save the file and that comma wasn't there, Sublime would quickly tell you what the problem was. Now, inside of the key binding, there are a few keys that you actually need to have in here to make a key binding. And the first of those is the keys key, which, as we can see here, is a list of strings. And we can look at the example key bindings that I have in here already to know that you can use a single key in here, for example, Control-Alt-P, which runs the command prompt select workspace. But you can also put a list of keys in here as well. For example, the revert modification is Control-K, Control-Z, which means press Control-K, then press Control-Z. And if you do those close enough together in time without a long second or two delay in between them, then Sublime will know that that command is the one to execute. It's also possible to put single characters in here. For example, if I did just this, then this key binding would trigger whenever I press the A key. That's a great thing to do, but I'd be very careful with that because if you're not careful, you lose the ability to type an A, because now every time you press the A key, this command triggers instead of typing an actual A. And if you do that incorrectly, you can redact your ability to actually modify the file and fix it. Perhaps best used in combination with multiple keys. For example, Control-K, Control-Z, A to do something. And that's what we used in the video where we created custom key bindings for the Sublime Merge integration. And if you're not sure what key to insert in here, you can turn on input logging, which we showed in the previous video, and press a keystroke, and then Sublime will tell you, if it sees that key, what it looks like here. And if you see something that says key event, that means you would put that actually in here. And if it says char event, that's just a single character, like, say, for example, a K. And as we can see there, if you're using package dev, it will provide auto completions for these as well, so you can get some of the more common items quickly and easily. The next item you need in here, of course, is a command, because your key needs to execute a command. Otherwise, what's the point of pressing it? And the command you put in there, we've already covered how to do that. Turn on command logging, look at existing key bindings, use the view package file command in the command palette to introspect menus and the command palette entries. You can view the video where we covered that to get more details on that, to determine what command you want to execute. Some, but not all commands require arguments, and you would provide those here if necessary. Some commands don't need arguments. For example, prompt select workspace, as we can see here, doesn't require any arguments, so it doesn't have an args key. However, toggle terminus panel does require an argument. It needs to know what the current working directory is, so that key binding does in fact have an argument. So you would add an argument key in there as well. And it's also worth pointing out again that if you're using package dev, you get auto completion. So I can say Control-Shift-T to easily bind that, and I could choose a command in here such as exec, like so, to autocomplete all of the known commands. And it will do the same thing with arguments to that command as well. So those are the three main items that you can put inside of a key binding: the key to trigger, the command to execute, any arguments that command might take. There's actually one extra item that can be provided here, and we can see examples of that if I was to scroll down through my custom key bindings files down to, say, around here. where this key binding says that when you press the enter key, it should execute the command double click at caret, but only in a very specific situation. Or the key binding below it that says control / should run a macro to comment out the current line and then advance the cursor down one line, but it only does it in a very specific case. And that's a very powerful concept in key bindings. You can tell Sublime not only what key you want to press and what command to run, but in what exact circumstances that key should be valid. This is an incredibly powerful concept that allows you to essentially override keys so you can take custom actions based on other criteria. But it's a pretty complicated topic, so we're going to cover that in another video. And so, as we can see, once you get a handle on a couple of key underlying concepts, key bindings are not as daunting as you might have thought they were. Much like the configuration file system in Sublime Text, they are very powerful and very expressive. And I hope you found this video informative and enlightening on an otherwise perhaps confusing topic. And if you have, please use those buttons down below the video to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And always please remember you can leave any sort of question or comment or request for clarification or suggestions for future videos you'd like me to make down in the comment section below this video. Until the next video, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.